I was asked this week from one of our agents what my opinion was of the law change that requires buyers to sign a representation agreement with their agent that's going to represent them as a buyer. The agent presented to me that they thought in the scheme of things, the new way the law works, where a buyer has to hire their agent and is obligated to pay them a commission, works against the buyer in negotiations. So I asked her to explain how she came to this conclusion, and on its face, it kind of makes sense. If a buyer is obligated to pay an agent, then their cost of entry into home ownership and making a purchase goes up. Okay, well, this is true. But the question is, why would a buyer automatically assume that the service of having a buyer's agent represent them should come at no cost to them? Because a buyer's agent only gets paid when they successfully negotiate and close a real estate purchase for the buyer. So why should that be free to the buyer? Because the buyer's paying a lender, a buyer's paying escrow fees, a buyer's paying title fees, a buyer's paying for the home inspection, a buyer is paying for the appraisal. Why wouldn't a buyer pay for their own representation? If you were going to court and you were going to hire an attorney, you would be paying for that attorney. If you go get your oil changed and your brakes fixed at a car repair shop, you are paying not only for the parts, you're paying for the service, the hourly rate of repair, correct? Well, see, in the history of real estate, buyers expected that the seller was going to cover the cost of the buyer's agent for the buyer. And realistically, this hasn't changed, except that it starts with the buyer being obligated to their agent, which makes the agent, by the way, obligated to the buyer. So the buyer and the buyer's agent are one team. And now the listing agent and the seller are the other team. And each is paying their respective representation. There are plenty of ways in writing an offer that allow the seller to pay the buyer's obligation to their broker. So your agent should be explaining to you, look, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I want you to hire me. I want to answer your questions, walk you through what I do to get your offer accepted, to help you negotiate, come up with the best terms that gets you the best result in the home that you want. You're going to pay me blank percentage in order to do so. But I am going to ask the seller to cover my expense. Now, this sounds great because any good listing agent is going to sit down with their seller when they are doing the paperwork to be hired and put the home on the market and say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I charge blank for the job of selling your home. And we don't have to decide now how much we're going to pay a buyer's agent. It's negotiable. But I want you to understand that while you're not obligated to pay a buyer's agent anything, almost every offer that we're going to receive is going to ask that you contribute or pay entirely for the buyer's representation. If we don't do this, and we can take it one offer at a time, the strongest offer, we can look at all the terms, the price, the length of time, concessions, and commissions for the buyer's agent. We can break it down individually, but if you're not ready to do that and we just blanketly say no, it's going to limit the amount of people in the marketplace that can even buy your home. Does that make sense? So if we hope that the listing agent has already put this thought and had this discussion with the seller, they're not going to be surprised when your buyer's agent writes the offer and asks the seller to cover that expense for you so that you don't have to pay it. Now the question becomes, well, that's great, but what happens if the seller won't pay? Realistically, watching hundreds of transactions go down since this law took effect, most of the time they do. Very rarely does a seller say no. And those are unique situations. But what does happen is that they may not cover the entire cost of the buyer's agent, okay? So let's say something standard in at least my area would be a buyer's agent saying, look, it's 2.5% in order for me to represent you, and we're going to ask the seller to cover it. So we write the offer. The seller wants to accept your offer, but they decide they're only going to pay 2%. So now that means the buyer's agent's going to collect the 2% out of the 2.5% they're completely owed for the job of representing you in the purchase of your home. And you as the buyer are obligated for 0.5%. Now, in a lot of cases, the numbers work out and you can do that. You get your home, we get it closed, everything's great. But there are a couple of ways still to find that other 0.5%. In some cases, we can find it from your lender. The lender can usually build in something in the loan to where it either saves you enough money to cover it, or the loan itself could hypothetically cover part or all of that missing 0.5%. Worst case scenario, if the buyer's agent is getting paid adequately enough where they decide, look, the 0.5% isn't worth it in this situation, let's go ahead and move forward. They can amend the contract they have with you and say, look, I'm going to do it on this house for 2% period. Now look, if they're generous enough to do that for you, remember, behave yourself and get through this transaction, and please listen to what they say, because they are giving up part of what they would get paid so you can get into your house. But I don't think on its face value that having the seller hire their own agent and the buyer hiring their own agent, where you're each obligated to pay your representation, does a disservice to anybody. So then the question becomes, well, okay, but doesn't that limit, like we said, a buyer's ability to get into a house? Sure, it can. There may be a situation to where a buyer falls in love with a home and the seller is absolutely not willing to pay anything towards the buyer's agent commission, and the buyer cannot make up the difference, in which case that may not be the home for you. It's sort of like a home listed for $500,000 and the highest you can go is $485,000. And no matter what you do and how much you beg and plead, you just can't get the seller to accept that offer because the terms overall don't fit what it is the buyer is capable or willing to do. So the situation's no different. What used to happen when the buyer's agents relied on the listing agent to dictate how much the buyer's agent was going to get paid, it was very easy to make the case for a buyer's agent having a potential buyer pulling property and steering the buyers to the homes that paid the most amount of commission. This eliminates that problem because now, even if you as a buyer go directly to the listing agent is working from the same playbook that a buyer's agent that's separate from the listing agent and only represents you has to play by, which is a contract, an obligation to pay commissions, and still has to go to the seller and ask the seller, listen, you're paying me to be your listing agent, and now I need you to pay me as well to represent the buyer that's going to buy your house. So it evens the playing field for everybody. I actually like it better this way because I'm hoping it puts buyers in the position where they actually pay attention to who they're hiring to represent them. Because all too often, especially like me, primarily a listing agent, I'm always at an advantage over a buyer's agent because buyer's agents aren't vetted very well by their clients. So it's very easy to win out in negotiations over somebody who is not an expert in the negotiation part and representing buyers. So it actually works in your favor, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. Don't be afraid of it. And to my agent friends, just get better. Just get better at representing your client. The commissions will follow.